really argue. We sort of wrestled.
Jacob and the angel. I mean, we're not saying which one is Jacob and which one is the angel.
But in typical Jewish style, we did a lot of wrestling. I hadn't thought about that before, Jim.
Yeah,
I think that's a good way to describe it. We wrestled.
Neither one of us got lamed.
No, we weren't hurt by the process. Matter of fact, I think we're closer than ever.
We're closer, but we also both learned so much.
Right, absolutely.
I always like when a book I think I'm writing teaches me.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. Before I moved from Massachusetts back to Florida, I visited with Jane Yolen and Barbara Diamond Golden to talk about their joint book of original feminist midrash, Meet Me at the Well, The Girls and Women of the Bible. We sat down in Jane's sunny kitchen and they just let it all pour out. I hardly needed to ask any questions. I'd love to hear about your favorite biblical women, so please do call in or leave a comment at bookoflifepodcast.com. Here with Jane Yolen and Barbara Diamond Golden, and we are here to talk about your new book that you've co-authored, Meet Me at the Well, The Girls and Women of the Bible. So first, please describe the book for our listeners.
I call it a feminist midrash of the women and the girls of the Bible for children and their parents. We have 9 main women, but 14, I think it's 14 altogether.
9 chapters, 14 women.
Yeah. And we really found ourselves being educated as we worked on this book, which is always one of the great things to happen when you're working on a book that is non-fictional.
Yeah, and so there's a large introduction and a piece afterwards that kind of explains where we're both coming from and the research process. There's a bibliography. But in the 9 chapters, there's a retelling of the woman's story. Of course, we don't leave out the man's story because it doesn't make sense sometimes, but we try to bring the woman forward. Then there's little boxes that have historical notes and folklore. Jane did a lot of those. I did a lot of the retellings, but we both worked on everything.
And those little boxes are really what we consider midrash, because they're explanations or explications or additional information or maybe a folk tale that parallels the story so that you can see each story set historically or allegorically or within a community or within a country with possibly variants of the story.
We sent a photocopy of a page in the Talmud and Haggadah with the historical notes and midrash there to give the editors an idea of the kind of format we were hoping that they could shoot for, but they actually did a job even better than we ever expected. You don't usually see that many regular publishers doing a text like this that has a story and then little boxes of midrash, but it looks very much like the Talmudic page. Also, we each did an original piece for each chapter. Jane did a poem and I did an Imagine piece, which is kind of like a Dear Diary piece.
So let's back up and explain what midrash is, in case anybody listening doesn't know.
Midrash is a collection of centuries of biblical commentary that rabbis and their students, when they studied Talmud, when they studied Torah, if the word didn't seem right, they would discuss it for hours upon hours. If they didn't quite understand what it meant within the context, or if they didn't understand the story. There were some very puzzling stories in the Bible, as we all know, especially for women. And we tried to tease out some of those meanings and set it in our midrash. But our midrash comes from the point of view of very 21st century women. And that makes a huge difference. Sometimes we were able to use some of the old biblical midrash, but other times we found there was nothing there that spoke to the condition of girls and women today. So that's when we would do an interpretation. And Barbara's, I think, brilliant little pieces of sort of Dear Diary kinds of imagination pieces is very much in the line of that sort of thing, but done from a female point of view.
Yeah, and Jane, often you would say that it was like a question, and you would head some of the little boxes with a question that a reader might ask.
So why did you call it Meet Me at the Well?
Well, it wasn't called that originally. Originally, we just called it Girls' Bible.
That was the working title for many years.
Yeah.
Did one of the editors come up with that?
Yes, one of the editors, we had two editors, one who was there at the beginning of it, but had two children in between. So she pushed it over to someone who was not married, not having children.
And not Jewish.
And not
Neither
Jewish.
one of them were.
Was Jewish. So they had interesting questions to ask. Neither one of them, I think, had never read the entire Bible or only knew certain stories from it. So they had very interesting questions. And one of the questions is, why are so many people meeting at the well? We did a little midrash about why so many of the girls are at the well. They're watering the animals, they're bringing water to the families, that's where they stand while they're doing that and gossiping, et cetera, et cetera. And that's when the editor said, why don't we call it Meet Me at the Well? Yeah.
And then the subtitles, Girls and Women of the Bible, I think.
Yeah.
So, we were very happy with that.
We say, I think a lot about this book because it took 10 years. Some of what happened is lost in memory.
That's right. Well, I do remember the first day you told me about the idea that the publishers were going for it. That's like really big in my memory because I was starting graduate school in library science and I said, oh, how am I going to do this? But anyway, that's part of the reason it took 10 years.
Along the way, there were deaths.
Job changes.
There were scholastic changes. There were teenage children to deal with.
Family health problems. Yeah, and also we had to figure out how we were going to do it, which took some time.
Well, it took some time because Barbara and I come from very different backgrounds. We're both Jewish, but I came from the extreme left wing and a family that celebrated no holidays. A father who lied about where he had been born. I didn't know where he had been born until I was 35. I thought he was born in Connecticut.
You can't just leave that there. Why did he lie about where he was born?
He and his family came over a spread of years from 1908 to 1914. He was the second youngest in the family. So when he came over, he was 7 and his younger brother was 6. All the other ones they're all gone now, but had vestiges of Yiddishisms in their speech. But when my father was dying, he was living with us the last 4 years of his life. I was sitting by his bedside in the hospital. It was one of 7 times he almost died. And he was babbling in obviously a Slavic language. When he woke up and said, what's for breakfast? I said, Dad, you were talking in Russian or something. He said, I don't know Russian. Turns out it was Ukrainian. I didn't even know then. I mean, I was a grown woman with 3 teenagers. I didn't know then. I didn't know until afterwards that not only had he been born in the Ukraine and came over when he was 7, and that his name wasn't Will Yolen, it was Belville. I think basically he felt American and was embarrassed by the Yiddishkeit. He wanted to separate himself from his family. He left home when he was 16 to become a reporter for the New Haven Register, I think it was, on the police beat. And he never looked back. My mother told me when I was 35, when I said something about, well, when Dad was born in New Haven, it was a very different place. And she said, he wasn't born in New Haven. And I went, what? Of course he was. Oh, did I make a mistake? Was it Waterbury? I never could quite get that clear whether it was Waterbury or New Haven, but they're pretty close. She said, he was born in the old country. And I went, what old country? And she said, the Ukraine. And I said, that can't possibly be true. But it was. When he moved in with us, I had his naturalization papers. I had cousins who found the Ellis Island and the boat manifest. It was in Ellis Island that Belleville became Will. Though it actually means wolf, which I love.
Yes.
And if I had known that my father's name meant wolf, my firstborn son would have been Wolf Stemple, which he would have loved because he's a rock and roll.
That's great.
He could change his name, Jane.
That's right.
It's too late. Now he does Irish music. I have a book of poems called Ekaterina Slav, adult poems, about his family coming over. Barbara came from
a conservative synagogue with an Orthodox rabbi. My parents kept kosher and they went to synagogue every Saturday, my father especially. So I went to Hebrew school, I went to Hebrew high school in Philadelphia, and then I've done a lot of workshop studying with rabbis since. I've been sort of self-educated as an adult studying with rabbis. So for me, the Torah, the Bible, we do the Old Testament only as it's called sometimes, is sacred material. I've done a lot of work with it, but I usually don't change it a whole lot. I'll try and put it into words that people can understand, whereas Jane is more of a storyteller, and we didn't realize we had this difference in approach, I don't think, to this material until we started.
I guess that we would
Did
have.
you?
Yeah. I minored in religion at Smith College, and I had read the Bible as text. So I was looking at many of these stories as where are the cultural references and where are the variants in any of the Abrahamic religions. That was my interest. I wasn't reading it as history or as sacred history. Barbara was reading it as sacred history. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we ever really argued during the writing of the book.
No, we didn't. We worked everything out.
Yep.
But there was like a figuring out, I'd say, trying to work with the material. We both stuck with it, though. We had two experts read it, Rabbi Saul Perlmutter and Shoshana Zonderman. That helped a lot, too. But we didn't really argue. We sort of wrestled. Yisrael.
Jacob and the great angel. I mean, we're not saying which one is Jacob and which one is the angel.
But in typical Jewish style, we did a lot of wrestling. I hadn't thought about that before, Jim.
Yeah,
I think that's a good way to describe it. We wrestled.
Neither one of us got lamed.
No, we weren't hurt by the process. Matter of fact, I think we're closer than ever.
We're closer, but we also both learned so much.
Right, absolutely.
I always like when a book I think I'm writing teaches me.
This certainly did that for both of us.
Absolutely.
So we've known each other for a long time. Jane was originally my teacher about 35 years ago. I took a workshop with her at Centrum in Port Townsend. And then when I moved back here, which was partly due to Jane's being here,
we became really good friends. She got invited into my critique group, which was great.
Yeah. But this is the first time I've ever collaborated with another author. Jane's had lots of experience doing that. So this is
I haven't murdered any of them either.
I would have heard, probably.
Now I'm thinking about what else can I sneakily get her to join me.
Anytime, Jane. It's been fun. Especially all these speaking engagements. I love it. We go in the car together and chatter away.
So what inspired this book in the first place? Did one of you have the inspiration to pull the other one in?
Jane did.
I did, more than 10 years ago. 10 years was when we actually began the actual process. When I was reading this in college, I read it very, very carefully and very thoroughly because I'm looking at heritage. I was probably the only Jewish girl in the course. They all knew New Testament, but they didn't know the Hebrew Bible. So I became the de facto expert, even though the teacher knew everything, because they would all look at me when we were discussing things about it. And as you can tell, I'm a big mouth. So I would make statements even when I didn't know what I was talking about. I have, over the years, talked about the stories that make me uncomfortable in the Bible. One of them being the binding of Isaac. The other one being Lot's wife. Mm-hmm. Well, she looked over her shoulder. Big deal, you know? She turned her into a pillar of salt. You could have just slapped her around. You didn't have
Hagar.
Yeah. And Hagar is one of the stories. Leah and
her sister.
And her sister.
Rachel.
I knew it wasn't Rebecca.
Rachel and Leah.
And the story of Dinah, which is horrible, horrible. What did Dinah do? She fell in love with the wrong guy. Well, actually, it was the right guy. The Jews were wrong in that case. Absolutely. You can argue with me.
But we didn't do Dinah, so
we didn't do Dinah.
We didn't wrestle with Dinah.
And then there's a story about, Barbara's tired of hearing talk, the story of Yael.
I'm not tired, but I have heard it a bunch of times.
Which they always bring it up when we're doing a talk. Whose story is buried in Deborah's story. And Deborah, we can all agree, first woman judge. There's nothing bad you can say about it. But then there's this little story embedded in it where when the Jews have actually overthrown the Canaanites, who were the fierce warriors with those chariots with scythes on their wheels, and Sisera, the head of the Canaanites, is running away, leaving his men, running away, comes to a little encampment between the Canaanites area and the Jews area. This little group of people were like the Switzerland, right? They didn't dare side with anyone, so they were the safe place for everyone. So he runs in, opens a tent, and goes in, and there's a woman standing there, and he says, "Woman," he says, "I'm tired. Bring me something to drink. I will lie down to sleep." So she brings him something to drink. He lies down to sleep. She takes a tent peg, she puts it on his head, and goes, bam, and kills him. And I go, what? Why did she kill him? There's no reason that I could suss out why she killed him. So it was always puzzling to me. And in Bible class, it was just there. It was hanging there. But when we decided to do Deborah as one of them, and we came upon the story of Yael, I did some research in feminist books about the Bible. And one woman was an anthropologist. And she said, look, this is what we know about this community. Hosting was very important to them, as it was to, as we see in many of the Jewish stories. Hosting was important. A woman had to keep herself sacred and apart. So she was living in her own tent. Her husband would come and visit her. Her husband was the head of the community. And when Sisera comes in and he walks into her tent, uninvited, without a male escort from their people, he has already, basically, called her indecent, called her a woman who sells herself, who opens herself to other men. He also has said she was a bad host because she didn't immediately offer him something to drink or something to eat. So in order to save herself and her husband, both of whom would have been thrown out of the community because she had dishonored herself and him, she had no other way of dealing with this but killing him.
Wow.
Even shrieking wouldn't have done. You had to...
That's quite a story.
Yeah, she's a good storyteller.
Yeah.
But one thing I do want to add is Jane especially did a lot of research in pulling pieces from the other Abrahamic religions, Islam and Christianity. So there are some little boxes about how they look at certain things. We did that partly to open it up to other readers and to inform Jewish readers too. So,
how did you choose the 14 women that you featured in this?
Some were gimmies, right?
Yeah, the four mothers. But yeah, we had to narrow it down. And Jane wanted, should I tell that story about Judith, right?
Yeah.
She wanted to do Judith, who's also a nice, gory, dramatic story. So here I was searching through the whole Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and I couldn't find it. So I thought, what's going on here? So I checked Encyclopedia Britannica, and it's an Apocrypha, along with the Hanukkah story. So I said, Jane, do you really want to explain Apocrypha to teenagers? Which I guess we could have done, but anyway, we left out Judith. So it was a process of...
We had more than enough.
Yeah.
But first we had to do the ones that everybody would say you left out. Mm-hmm. And then the ones that we didn't want to leave out were the four women whose stories were not buried behind men's. Mm-hmm. And that was Naomi and Ruth, Esther, Deborah. So those we knew. And we knew we had to do the mothers. Mm-hmm. Barbara really wanted to do Hannah.
I
which is not a big story. It has an important moment in it. A large moment for a small woman, which I kind of like, because we have Deborah and she's big. She knows what she's doing. She has control. Hannah has no control. She's absolutely put upon by...
Yeah, the other wife.
The other wife.
I have the book. I'll look at the intro.
By the guy at the temple who shouts at her, as woman, stop mumbling, you're probably drunk, shut up. And she's doing this small prayer because she's offering her only child to God. And so she becomes, whether she knew it or not, she becomes the woman who made the first solo prayer to God.
Yeah, I didn't know that till we did the book.
And that became big. That's a big thing. But the story itself is small. And so Barbara had to convince me how important this was.
Right, so looking at the table of contents, of course we also did Eve, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah are one chapter, and then Miriam we also included Yocheved, Zipporah.
Because in Miriam's story, there are all these strong women, some of whom are not even named. They are Pharaoh's daughter, or Pharaoh's wife, depending upon your version. They are the two midwives. The rabbis have given us names for them, but the names aren't in Torah. There is Zipporah, who is Moses' wife, who's also a strong woman in her own right. But again, they're all within the Moses story and got hidden by that. And Miriam, who was a seeress from the age of, 5 or something like that, who was a truth sayer when they were out in the desert, who was the one who God gave first. He gave her leprosy, and then he gave her a well.
Right.
And the well she carries, well, she's not holding it, but it's supposedly behind her. So she's a very important story who gets buried in the story of Moses. I'm fascinated by how these women got buried. And that may have come from, to get back to your original question, we've come a long way from your original question, which was, what was the kernel of this idea? I think it came from Smith College when I was questioning why these stories had gotten buried. We weren't reading just the women's stories, we were reading the Bible. And this was long before the big women's movement had started. This was probably 1962. There had been the women's movement, and then it died, and then it got sort of resurrected by Gloria Steinem. And so my class, when we graduated, we were the class that became the glass ceiling breakers. So I was in there listening to these women and wondering why this was not happening in the Bible. So I think I was thinking about this book for a long time before I ever knew there was a book there. Just that I knew that there was something interesting there.
See, also, we both had the experience of not having a bat mitzvah the way a boy did in both of our synagogues, and I think that stuck with us, too. You know, we wanted to be able to read Torah at the Bima. And
well, I did.
You did.
I did,
but,
because there was a confirmation class.
Yeah.
None of the boys were paying any attention, so me being an overachiever, I learned to read my Torah portion. So I was the one who got up to read.
Yeah, and then I later became a bar mitzvah tutor, which was how I overcame it. But I think we both had this kind of a little bit of anger or something.
Sense of disappointment.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So in going through the table of contents, we did Deborah and Yael, Hannah, Naomi and Ruth, Esther. I mean, those made the most sense to us. And like Jane said, we had so much material, we decided to leave it at that.
And there were also the nice women. Well, some of them, I mean, Sarah has a problem with Hagar. But you say Hagar, I say Hagar.
That's a song.
Let's call the whole thing off. But I think they wanted the book a little more contained, which is what we did.
Yeah, and we also thought it would make a nice bat mitzvah book, which actually goes back to our own things about a bat mitzvah and feeling like a young woman it would, benefit from having something like this. And then the illustrations turned out to be wonderful. We really were happy with that. It took them about a year to find the illustrators.
And she's Israeli. Though I have to tell you, I used to be an editor, and I work closely with art directors all the time. And in the Eve chapter, the picture came in first. It was a beautiful picture, but they both had navels in the original one. And I went, excuse me. This has been a long history of pilpul over navels, They wouldn't really have navels. They were not born. They were created, right? She just erased them, put a little more foliage up.
Yeah, so then what would happen, maybe a period of 6 months would go by, and then the editors would get it back to us, or a year, and then we'd have to almost do the research over again because she forgets stuff, and that's part of why it took a while.
Because sometimes they'd ask a question that we remembered vaguely where we had that information, and I was researching on 2 continents.
Right.
Because I was researching here, in the Smith Library, in the Amherst Library, UMass Library. But I was also, and borrowing books from Barbara,
right.
I was also researching in Scotland because the University of St. Andrews has a huge religious studies program. And it's basically Christian. And so I went into the library thinking, maybe they'll have something, because I really needed some stuff. And they had like 10 volumes of feminist critique of Hebrew Testament. I'm going, really? this is wonderful. So I'm sitting there and I'm writing things.
Tickler primer,
Yeah.
Clancy.
So it was fascinating, but I wouldn't have found them here.
And then they asked us about some of the quotations, and the books were in Scotland, correct?
Yes. So then we had to sort of say, all right, we can't quote this exactly. It says somewhere in Gretzky this.
It was quite a process.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that in this process you learned things you hadn't even known before about these stories. And the stories are familiar, but there's always something
Right.
new. So was there anything else that particularly surprised you?
Well, did you know about the whole Lilith story? Because Jane did a lot on Lilith. And
I had known the Lilith story, but I didn't know all the connections. Lilith is just an amazing story. And I didn't know before I started that about
the amulets.
the amulets with the
Right.
three angels' names on it that people still in very Orthodox or Hasidic,
Yeah.
So Lilith is Adam's first wife because there are two stories
Of the creation.
in the creation stories. One is that Adam is made and Eve is taken from his
Riverside.
side. But in the earlier one, it says that God made man and woman out of the earth. He made them at the same time, all right? Because the various rabbis were trying to make sense of why there were not one but two stories of how human beings came. And very different stories. One is the woman is dependent on the man, and that's the story where she also is the one who causes the fall. And the other one where they are both equal, and then that story disappears. I mean, it's there, but it's nothing is said about it. So struggling to figure this out, one of the things they came up with was the story of Lilith, which was probably, we think, a Babylonian demon story. The story is that Lilith wanted to be equal because she was produced equally. And Adam went to God and said, this woman was meant to be my helpmeet, and she's not. She wants to be equal. Do something. And so God sends an angel to her and says, you need to do things for your husband. You are not equal. So she says, all right, I'm leaving. And she leaves the Garden of Eden, goes to the Red Sea or the Dead Sea?
The Red Sea, it says.
The Red Sea.
It says here.
I'm quoting.
Quoting.
She wrote it.
The Red
Let's
Sea,
continue.
where she cavorted with demons who raised her up to be their queen, and she had many demon babies. God sent the angels back there, 3 of them. What are their names?
Well, they're in here. It's Senoi, Sansenoi, and Samangalaf, and I dare you to try and remember that.
I cannot remember.
We
that.
can never.
Okay.
So that's why I got, open the book up here.
So he sent those 3 angels, the S's, to her and said, God will forgive you if you come back and be Adam's helpmeet. And she said, I'm doing just fine here. So God sent them back to kill all her demon babies. Now, if you think about it, there may be a relationship with that story and with Pharaoh killing all the Jewish babies.
Oh, wow.
I never thought about that.
Yeah.
Did you just think about that?
I've been thinking about it for some time, but I didn't get into the book because I couldn't find
Any research?
any research.
It's the
any
first I've
research.
heard of that.
So he said to Lilith, and now you will be the angel of death, and you will kill Jewish babies unless they are made safe by an amulet either around their neck or hanging over the cradle with the names of my 3 angels.
Some Jews still do this, hang
Yeah.
the amulets.
Wow.
Yeah.
You hadn't heard about that story?
No, that's a new one
But,
to me.
so for years, Lilith was the angel of death. And then, about 30 years ago, Jewish feminists reclaimed Lilith. And the Jewish Feminist magazine, since that time, has been Lilith.
Right.
Strong woman, not going to be subservient to any man. So the name and the idea has been lifted.
But you won't find Angel of Death in the book because Jane has more recently come to that, right?
Yeah.
Calling her the Angel of Death.
Well, she was. I mean, she was the angel
Yeah,
of
right,
baby's
right.
death.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right.
She would take her revenge by killing human infants, and there's a whole big paragraph on that.
Yep.
Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about that we haven't already covered?
As somebody who has worked a lot co-authoring with other people with all three of my children, one short story with my husband, but also with writers like Bruce Coville and Robert J. Harris and
Nancy Willard?
Nancy Willard and I did a book of poetry on angels. She did the Christian angels and I did the Jewish angels. And other people like that. I find that there are many ways to co-author, but they all have to begin with love and trust. If you don't believe that the other person is worthy of working with you, or if you don't believe that you are worthy of working with the other person, don't do it. It will be bad. Because you are going to have to be teasing out things from the other person's brain. You're going to have to be trying to understand why they wrote something before you critique it or criticize it. And you cannot come to it thinking you're the top dog. Even if you are, you shouldn't be thinking that you're top dog. My rule of thumb is always, whoever thought up the idea gets first billing. Everybody shares in the profits, if there are any. Because it's not only co-authoring, it's a partnership. Mm-hmm. It's almost like if there's a big difference in age, it's mother and child. If there is no difference in age at all, it's as if you are married for a book together.
Right, and Jane had been my teacher, my mentor, continued to be, even though we were in the same writing group. And I had to work on that in the beginning. You probably noticed that It was hard for me to speak up or say, Jane, I don't agree with you on this. I mean, even though we had critiqued each other's work, it was in a group.
Yep.
And so I think for the first few years, that was something I was dealing with. That took a while.
This certainly made you think 2 or 3 times about that.
Wow, what a process.
But I considered in many ways you were my mentor in this book because it was more your wheelhouse than mine.
Right, so I figured that's probably why you asked me. So that, did make a difference that way because I had done so much work on Judaic and Midrash. Although I never would have tackled the Bible by myself.
We held hands and jumped into the abyss.
Jane had no idea what she was going into, I think. One thing I do want to say is, which Jane honored, is in all my writing I try never to do he or she with God, a gender pronoun, and Jane honored that. And so I was happy about that because I like kids to think of God as God and not a he or she.
So we were talking about how many books each of you have done. Do either of you have a new book that you want to plug while we have the opportunity?
I have a Holocaust novel that's just out called Mapping the Bones, based on the armature of Hansel and Gretel. If you think about the Hansel and Gretel story, it comes in 3 sections. The first section, they're starving in their house. The second section, children are left in the woods. And in the third section, they find the house of candy and the wicked witch, and in the end, she's pushed into the oven. You say the word oven between 2 Jews, my editor was Jewish, you're either talking a recipe or you're talking Holocaust. So it starts in the Watch ghetto, where they're starving. The parents, desperate to save their children, take them to the partisans in the forest, and then they get, by hook and crook and terrible things happening, to a labor camp. Yes, there is a witch, and yes, there is an oven, but I won't tell you what happens.
And that's Mapping the Bones.
That's Mapping the Bones, yeah.
And it's your 3rd Holocaust novel, right?
Yes, no more. That's it. Nobody should write more than 3 Holocaust novels.
So I'm working on something, but it's early stages, so I'd rather not talk about it. But I would like to plug my last book, which came out last year, From Apples and Honey, A Passover Cowboy, and it's a picture book. I'm very interested in where Jews have settled all over the world. I've done other books on that. And so it's about the Jews who were transported during the shtetl time from Eastern Europe to Argentina. Baron de Hirsch was the philanthropist, and they were supposed to set up farming communities, which they did, and then they ended up living side by side with gauchos, so I thought that was a really interesting mix.
I love this book.
I love the book, too, and it was something that I'd worked on years ago and then took it out again. I was really happy with it,
We're very interested in our entire group. It has Patricia McLaughlin, Ann Turner, Corinne Demas, Ellen Whitlinger, and Leslie Newman, besides the 2 of us, of going and finding old pieces that didn't work, then 20 years later you know what to do with it, or 20 years later its time has come. I call it the great retread, or restoration. Her book there is the perfect example of it. It was a great idea. Wrong time, for two reasons. She wasn't ready to write it, and the market wasn't ready. The market now has several very interesting small Jewish publishers.
Like Apples and Honey and
Carban and places like that. And PJ Library, which supports these kinds of small books. I'll tell you a story that it'll sort of explain everything you need to know about children's publishing and Jewish books. I have a big series, call it the Dino State. It's How Do Dinosaurs books. And they came to me and said, would you write a How Do Dinosaurs Say Merry Christmas? And I said, only if I can say, how do dinosaurs say Happy Hanukkah? And they said, we can't sell more than 20,000 copies of that. And I looked at them and thinking to myself, Carben and Apples and Honey and the PJ Library would love 20,000 copies sold. I finally looked at them and I said, okay, pay me less up front. And they said, all right, we can do that. And of course, PJ Library bought 18,000 copies, and then they sold another almost 20,000 copies over that. And that's how publishers are looking not so much at the book, but how many books they can sell. But Barbara rethought this story, and the market was there, which hadn't been there. I don't think that existed.
I'm not sure, well, diversity is big now. Not that this is necessarily diversity, but kind of fits in with multicultural. And, because I had come across the idea when I did Journeys with Elijah, and the editor asked me to set the stories in all the places Jews have lived, so I researched Argentina, and my family has a connection because a lot of my relatives live in Bogota, Colombia. So,
excellent.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you pushed for How Do Dinosaurs Say Happy Hanukkah. When that came out, I was so excited.
And you know what? It keeps selling.
Yeah.
You know, for each new child that's born, it's in a family that didn't have children before, that becomes the de facto book that they buy for Hanukkah.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Jane, Barbara, thank you so much. It's been great talking with you.
It's been fun talking to you too.
Yes, Heidi, thank you.
Hi, this is Anne Renaud, author of Fanya's Heart. I'll be joining you soon on the Book of Life, and I'd like to dedicate my episode to Fanya Landau Feiner and her fellow prisoners who managed to find light even in the darkest of places.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/bookoflife. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening and happy reading.